The morning of December 22nd, 1944 arrived over Bastogne, the way all mornings had arrived that week, gray, frozen, and thick with the smell of smoke. Not the clean smoke of wood fires. The smoke of burning buildings, burning vehicles, burning men. Staff Sergeant Schuyler Jackson presses back against the stone wall of a ruined farmhouse on the eastern edge of the town and watched the sky. It was the kind of sky that offered nothing. Low clouds, the color of old lead, sat so heavy over the Ardennes that you couldn't see where the horizon ended and the earth began. No American aircraft had been visible for days. The clouds had seen to that. The same clouds that grounded the resupply missions. The same clouds that grounded the fighters. The same clouds that had been in their quiet, indifferent way, killing the men of the 101st Airborne Division as surely as any German shell. Jackson had been in Bastogne for 5 days. 5 days that felt like 5 months. Before the Bulge broke open on December 16th, the 101st had been resting near Reims, France, pulled back from the line to refit, resupply, recover. They had fought hard in Holland during Operation Market Garden in September. They had earned the rest. Then, at 2 a.m. on December 17th, the order came. Load up. We're moving. Where? Bastogne. Why? Nobody told them. They climbed into trucks in the dark and drove north toward the sound of something enormous collapsing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What was collapsing was the entire American front in the Ardennes. 3 German armies. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, comprising roughly 250,000 men, 800 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, had erupted out of the winter forest on December 16th with a ferocity that caught the Allied High Command almost completely off guard. The plan, conceived by Adolf Hitler himself over the objections of his generals, was to drive through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp, cutting the Allied supply lines, splitting the British and American armies, forcing a negotiated peace before the Soviets closed in from the east. It was, by any measured analysis, an act of desperation dressed up as strategic genius. But in those first hours, it worked. American divisions along the Schnee-Eifel were encircled and captured wholesale. The 89th Corps crumpled. Entire regiments disappeared. The penetration tore through the American lines like a fist through wet paper, and at the center of the breach, at the junction of 7 major roads through the Ardennes, sat a small Belgian market town of perhaps 4,000 civilians that suddenly became the most important piece of real estate in Western Europe. Bastogne. The roads converging at Bastogne were not a strategic luxury. They were a logistical necessity. Whoever controlled those crossroads controlled movement through the Ardennes. The Germans needed them to keep their armor columns moving west. The Americans needed to deny them at nearly any cost. When the 101st Airborne arrived on the 18th of December, they arrived without their artillery ammunition, without adequate winter clothing, without sufficient medical supplies, and without a clear idea of exactly what they were driving into. They were, in the military parlance of the era, a thumb being shoved into a very large crack. Their commander was not even present when they arrived. Major General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington. The acting commander was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a soft-spoken artilleryman who would, within 4 days, deliver the most famous single-word reply in the history of the United States Army. But all of that came later. In those early days, the 101st simply dug in, spread their thin lines around the town's perimeter, and waited for the Germans to arrive. They did not wait long. Sergeant Jackson had come to the 101st by an unremarkable road. Born in 1919 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, he had worked in a steel mill before the draft took him in the autumn of 1942. He trained at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, the notorious hilltop facility where future paratroopers were broken down and rebuilt under a regimen that was, by design, intended to eliminate anyone who wasn't exceptional. He qualified as a paratrooper, earned his wings, and was assigned to the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. He had jumped into Normandy in the early hours of June 6, 1944, descending into darkness and chaos over the Norman hedgerows. He had fought through Holland. By the time the trucks dropped him outside Bastogne in December, He had been in combat long enough to stop flinching at artillery and to start flinching at silence. The perimeter the 101st established around Bastogne was roughly 16 miles in circumference. Holding that perimeter were approximately 18,000 American troops, many of them from units other than the 101st. Stragglers, tankers from Combat Command via the 10th Armored Division, engineers pressed into service as infantry, medics carrying rifles. A patchwork army. Against them, the Germans committed elements of 5 divisions, including the experienced and well-equipped Panzerlehr Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and eventually portions of the 2nd Panzer Division and the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division. By December 19th, Bastogne was encircled, completely, 101 kilometers from the nearest friendly forces. No road in, no road out. A pocket of Americans sitting inside a ring of German steel, with supplies running out and temperatures dropping toward 0 Fahrenheit. What the Germans could not fully appreciate, what their intelligence consistently underestimated, was the particular psychology of the men they had surrounded. The paratroopers of the 101st had been trained for precisely this kind of isolation. They had been told, from their earliest days at Toccoa, that being surrounded was not a catastrophe. It was, in the airborne doctrine of the era, simply the operational environment. When you jump behind enemy lines, you are by definition surrounded. That is where airborne soldiers live. That is where they fight best. Still, even the most psychologically hardened soldier cannot eat doctrine. By December 21st, the situation inside the perimeter had become genuinely critical in ways that had nothing to do with morale or fighting spirit. The medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Surgeons at the makeshift hospital in the Heinz barracks were operating on wounded men with inadequate anesthesia, performing amputations in the dark, packing wounds with bandages that had already been used and re-washed. The artillery battalions were rationing shells to roughly 10 rounds per gun per day. Men who had jumped into Bastogne in their summer weight jumpsuits, the resupply of winter gear having been disrupted by the speed of the German advance, wrapped themselves in burlap sacks, curtains torn from civilian homes, anything that could hold body heat against temperatures that would ultimately reach minus 20 degrees Celsius in the first week of January. Food was scarce but not yet catastrophic. Ammunition was tighter. Medical supplies were the most desperate shortage of all. It was into this specific crisis that Sergeant Jackson received his assignment on the morning of December 22nd. The situation had been building since the previous evening. German units pressing the perimeter near Flamierge on the western side had overrun an aid station attached to the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. 3 American medics had been captured, along with a quantity of medical supplies that the garrison could not afford to lose. More critically, the soldiers in that sector were reporting that German artillery had been registering on the aid station's location, which suggested either a deliberate targeting of protected facility or that the Germans had moved up their own medical unit and were using position in ways that violated protections theoretically afforded by the Geneva Convention. The regimental surgeon, Major Douglas Davidson, needed information. He needed to know what had happened to the captured medics. He needed to know whether the German lines in that sector were as tightly drawn as the forward observers believed, or whether there were gaps that could be exploited for resupply movement. And he needed, if at all possible, some kind of contact with German medical authorities that might result in the return of the captured men and the supplies. It was a kind of mission that defied easy categorization. It was not a combat patrol. It was not a reconnaissance in the traditional sense. It was something older and stranger, an attempt to move through a siege line and make contact with the besieging force under the implicit protection of a white flag and a red cross, with all the uncertainty that such protection carried in the winter of 1944. Davidson did not ask for volunteers in any formal sense. He explained what he needed to Jackson and to the 2 men Jackson would take with him, Private First Class Raymond Hernandez, a medic from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had been tending wounds since the first night of the encirclement, and Private Thomas Czerny, a Polish-American from Chicago who spoke passable German and had twice before served as an informal interpreter during prisoner interrogations. Jackson listened to the briefing, asked 3 questions about the last known position of the German outpost line near Mont de Saint-Etienne, and said he would be ready in an hour. What he did not say, and what Davidson could not have said, was whether any of them would come back. The white flag was a pillowcase from a civilian bedroom in the farmhouse where the regimental aid station had been established. It was tied to a broomstick. It was the most fragile piece of equipment any of them carried. They moved out at 10:45 in the morning, heading northwest through the snow toward the German lines near the hamlet of Mont-de-Saint-Étienne. The sky had lightened slightly, not cleared, never truly cleared during those weeks, but the snow had stopped falling for a few hours, which meant visibility had opened to perhaps 150 yards. For Bastogne in December, that was almost generous. Jackson set the pace. He walked in front, which was partly tactical. He was a senior man, and partly something more personal. He had decided, in the quiet way that soldiers sometimes decide these things, that if someone was going to draw fire first, it should be him. Hernandez carried the medical bag on his left shoulder, the Red Cross armband visible on his right. Czerny held the broomstick with both hands, the white pillowcase hanging limp in the still air. They crossed the American outpost line at a gap, near a burned-out Kubel wagon that had been knocked out 3 days earlier and left as a landmark. The American soldier in the foxhole beside the gap was a corporal named Aldridge from Georgia, who watched them pass without a word, then turned his face back to the tree line ahead. He did not say good luck. Soldiers in Bastogne had stopped saying things like that. The ground between the lines was not no man's land in the First World War sense. There were no parallel trenches, no continuous wire. The German encirclement was loose enough in places that gaps existed. Not safe gaps, not reliably unobserved gaps, but physical spaces between outposts where movement was possible if timed carefully, and if the morning visibility remained poor enough to provide cover without being so poor that the white flag became invisible. For the first 400 yards, they moved in silence. The snow was a foot deep in the open, crusted on top but hollow underneath, so that each step broke through the crust with a sound that seemed, in the silence, impossibly loud. Jackson watched the tree line to the northwest. Hernandez watched left. Czerny watched right. Nobody watched behind them. At perhaps 500 yards from the American outpost line, they reached the first marker Davidson had described, a stone boundary wall, half collapsed, running north to south across the field. This was, according to the last confirmed intelligence, approximately the forward edge of the German outpost zone, not the main line of resistance, but the screen of pickets and listening posts that the Germans maintained to give early warning of American movement. Jackson stopped at the wall. He looked at Czerny. Czerny raised the broomstick higher and called out, in German, toward the tree line. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. The words he had rehearsed. Red Cross. Medical personnel. We wish to speak with your commanding officer. Silence. The tree line did not move. No answer came. Jackson counted seconds. 30. 40. He was considering whether to call again when the first German appeared. He came from the left, not the tree line ahead. A single soldier in a long greatcoat and a coal scuttle helmet, stepping out from behind the stone wall itself, from a position Jackson had walked past without seeing. A Carabiner 98K was pointed at the three Americans. Then a second German appeared, and a third, materializing from the snow and the brush with the unsettling ease of men who had been watching and waiting. The German who appeared to be in command, a Feldwebel, a sergeant, roughly Jackson's age, with frost on his eyebrows and the particular stillness of a man who had been standing in cold air for a very long time, looked at the white flag, at the Red Cross armband, at the three Americans, and said something quietly to his men. The rifles did not lower, but they did not fire. Then the Feldwebel said in careful English, "Where are you going?" Jackson answered steadily, "We are looking for your medical officer. We have information about American wounded, and we believe you may be holding 3 American medics." The German looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere distant, artillery rumbled. "Come," the Feldwebel said at last. "I will take you to my officer." They were not blindfolded. That was the first thing Jackson noted. In the tactical literature of the era, prisoners and parley delegations were frequently blindfolded to prevent intelligence gathering. The fact that the Germans made no attempt to prevent Jackson and his men from observing the route suggested one of two things. Either the German sergeant was operating on instinct rather than protocol, or the Germans were confident enough in their position that the observation of an American sergeant made no difference to them. Given what Jackson saw during the next 800 yards, it was almost certainly the latter. The German outpost zone was more densely populated than American intelligence had suggested. Not catastrophically so. The paratroopers' reconnaissance had correctly identified the general positions, but the depth of the German deployment in this sector was greater than the map showed. Jackson counted 11 individual fighting positions within the first quarter mile, saw evidence of a mortar battery dug in behind a farmhouse, and noted that the German soldiers he passed wore the distinctive collar insignia of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. These were not the elite Waffen-SS units that American propaganda sometimes portrayed as the totality of German opposition. These were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, Volksgrenadier, People's Grenadiers, a category created in late 1944 from a mixture of experienced veterans, recovered wounded, and conscripts drawn from occupational deferment pools. The division had been rebuilt after suffering severe losses on the Eastern Front. They were tired men, cold men, but they were in position, they were armed, and there were a great many of them. The farmhouse to which the Feldwebel led them had been converted into a battalion command post. A wood fire burned in the main room. The smell of it was almost physically painful after the days of cold. Several German officers stood around a map table. A medical officer, identifiable by the dark blue piping on his uniform and the caduceus insignia on his collar, stood to one side. The battalion commander, an Oberstleutnant who introduced himself with a precise formality that seemed almost ceremonial given the context, looked at Jackson's delegation for a moment. Then he spoke in German. Czerny translated quietly. He says he is surprised they sent a sergeant. Jackson replied that a sergeant was who they sent. The German medical officer stepped forward. His name, as Czerny translated, was Dr. Werner Holtz. He was, he explained, aware of the 3 American medics. They were being held in a farmhouse approximately a kilometer to the rear. They were unharmed. He had personally examined them. One had a minor frostbite injury to his left hand, which Holtz had treated. The other 2 were in acceptable condition. Jackson asked about the medical supplies that had been taken with them. Holtz paused. He exchanged a brief look with the Oberstleutnant. Then he answered that some of the supplies had been distributed to German wounded. He was, he said, apologetic about this. But his own supplies were also limited, and the wounded had required immediate treatment. Jackson absorbed this. He was not in a position to protest. He was not in a position to demand. He was, in the fundamental reality of the situation, a sergeant from a surrounded garrison sitting in a German battalion command post holding a pillowcase on a broomstick. But then something happened that none of them had anticipated. The Oberstleutnant spoke again, at length this time. Czerny listened carefully, then turned to Jackson. His voice was quiet and precise. He says he wants to offer you something. Not a prisoner exchange. Something different, he says. Czerny paused, choosing the right words. He says his division commander has authorized him to offer the American garrison an opportunity to discuss terms of surrender. He says the position of Bastogne is strategically untenable. He says the garrison is surrounded. The weather will not lift for resupply. The Americans have no armor sufficient to break through, and that continuing resistance will result in the destruction of the town and the deaths of many soldiers and civilians who might otherwise survive. He says this offer comes from a position of respect, not contempt. He says he has seen how the Americans fight. Jackson looked at the German officer for a long moment. He said he would need to bring the message back to his commanding general. The Oberstleutnant nodded. That was, he said, what he expected. Then Dr. Holtz said something else that Czerny translated with a slight hesitation, as if uncertain he had understood correctly. He says he wants to give you something to take back. He says, another pause. He says he wants to give you back the 3 medics, and he wants to give you back as many of the medical supplies as can be returned. He says wounded men are wounded men, and that this is separate from the military question. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The return journey began 40 minutes later. Jackson walked in front again, the same formation as before. Behind him, the 3 recovered medics, Private First Class Arthur Bergman of Cleveland, Private Samuel Torres of San Antonio, Private Harold Keene of Portland, walked in a loose column. Bergman's left hand was wrapped in a clean German bandage. The medical bag Hernandez now carried was heavier than the one he had brought out. Not complete. Perhaps a third of what had been taken. But sulfur powder, morphine, bandaging material, things that would save lives before the week was out. Czerny still carried the broomstick with the white pillowcase. It seemed more significant now than it had 2 hours ago. The German Feldwebel walked them back to the stone boundary wall. At the wall, he stopped. He said something to Czerny. Czerny listened, then turned to Jackson. He says, "You're either very brave or very stupid to have come out here." Jackson considered this for a moment. Tell him that in the American Army, he said, those are frequently the same thing. Czerny translated. The Feldwebel looked at Jackson. Something moved briefly across his face that was not quite a smile, but was perhaps the closest thing available to one on a morning like that. Then he turned and walked back into the snow. Jackson and his men crossed back into the American outpost line at 12:40, just under 2 hours after they had left. Corporal Aldridge in the foxhole by the burned Kubel wagon watched them come through without speaking, then turned back to his vigil over the tree line. At the regimental aid station, Major Davidson looked at the returned medics, at the partial medical supplies, and then at Jackson's face. "There's something else," Davidson said. It wasn't a question. Jackson handed over the written note the Oberstleutnant had given him, hand-printed in German on a sheet torn from a field notebook. Czerny had already provided an oral translation on the walk back, but the physical document was important. Davidson read it, looked up, read it again. "They want us to surrender." "Yes, sir." "What did you tell them?" "That I'd bring it back." Davidson nodded slowly. The note would be passed up the chain of command. It would reach Brigadier General McAuliffe's headquarters that afternoon. McAuliffe would read it, look at his operations officer, and reportedly say something dismissive in language unsuitable for official correspondence before his staff persuaded him that a formal written reply was appropriate. The reply McAuliffe ultimately composed and transmitted to the German command consisted of a single word that has since entered the permanent record of American military history. Nuts! But all of that happened later. And it happened in part because a sergeant from Pennsylvania walked through a German siege line with a pillowcase on a broomstick and came back with 3 men and a message in the careful, observant eyes that would tell Davidson and McCall's intelligence staff more about the German deployment in the western sector than any aerial photograph had provided in days. The story of Bastogne has been told and retold so many times that it has acquired the hard, simplified edges of mythology, the 101st holding out against impossible odds. McCall's defiant reply. Patton's Third Army racing north through the snow. The clouds finally breaking on December 23rd, and the C-47s appearing over the town like something from a dream, dropping supplies by parachute while P-47 Thunderbolts worked over the German columns below. All of that is true. All of it happened. But mythology, by its nature, compresses and smooths, and in the smoothing it loses the texture of the actual event. The cold, the specific hunger, the particular darkness of a frozen Ardennes night, and the smaller human moments that held the larger story together. One of those moments was Sergeant Jackson's walk, the formal German demand for surrender, which arrived at McCall's headquarters on the afternoon of December 22nd via 2 German officers carrying a white flag, has been extensively documented. The 4-paragraph message, signed by the German commander of the encircling forces, referred to the well-known American military tradition of avoiding unnecessary bloodshed, and gave the Americans 2 hours to respond. What has received less attention is the intelligence value of the American delegation's observations during the journey to and from the German command post. The information Jackson brought back, the density of the Volksgrenadier positions in the western sector, the location of the mortar battery, the general state of German supply and morale, as observed in the demeanor and equipment of the soldiers he passed, was incorporated into the defensive planning for the following 48 hours. When the Germans attacked in force on the night of December 22nd and the morning of December 23rd, the defenders in the western sector had a more accurate picture of what was coming than they would otherwise have had. The 3 recovered medics returned to duty within hours of their return. Bergman's frostbitten hand was treated properly with the sulfur powder that Dr. Holtz had returned. Torres and Keene went back to work in the aid station before dark. The medical supplies, though partial, extended the garrison's ability to treat the wounded by a margin that Davidson later estimated, in his after-action report, as approximately 36 hours. 36 hours. In the context of Bastogne, where everything was measured in hours, that was not a small thing. On December 23rd, the clouds broke. The supply drops began. The P-47s appeared. The German stranglehold on the sky would have been as complete and as suffocating as the encirclement itself, was suddenly lifted by a meteorological accident, a high-pressure system rolling in from the east that nobody had predicted and that the Allied air forces exploited with the kind of aggressive efficiency that had become their signature. 241 C-47s dropped supplies into Bastogne perimeter on that first clear day. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, blankets, enough to make the garrison viable again. On December 26th, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, racing north in Patton's great lateral redeployment, reached the southern edge of the perimeter near the village of Assinois. The corridor was narrow, barely 100 yards wide at first, under German fire from both sides. But it was a corridor. The siege was broken. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month. The German offensive, having failed to reach the Meuse River, was ground down by Allied air power, supply advantages, and the simple arithmetic of a coalition that could replace its losses and an enemy that increasingly could not. By the end of January 1945, the front line had been restored roughly to where it had stood before December 16th. The Germans had spent irreplaceable men, tanks, and fuel on an operation that had achieved nothing except a slight delay in the inevitable. The cost on the American side had been severe. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest single engagement fought by American forces in the Second World War. Approximately 75,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. 19,000 killed. Men who had survived Normandy, North Africa, Italy, died in Belgian snow because an increasingly desperate enemy chose to gamble everything on a winter offensive through the rain that their own generals had called impassable. Bastogne survived. The town was damaged, heavily shelled throughout the siege, partially rebuilt during the fighting itself by civilians and soldiers working side by side, but it was not destroyed. The 4,000 Belgian civilians who had remained through the encirclement emerged from their cellars and their barns when the corridor opened, blinking at the column of Sherman tanks that came grinding up the road from Assinois and found themselves improbably alive. Sergeant Jackson was still alive, too. He had not been conspicuously brave in a way that the citation writers understood bravery. There had been no single dramatic moment, no machine gun seized, no position held against overwhelming odds. What he had done was quieter and in some ways more difficult. He had walked through enemy lines under a white flag, conducted himself with sufficient composure to obtain the release of 3 prisoners and the partial return of medical supplies, observed the enemy position with the careful attention of a trained soldier, and carried back intelligence that was put to practical use. He had also, in the course of a 40-minute conversation in a German battalion command post, given Major Davidson and General McAuliffe something else. Confirmation of the German command, whatever the confidence of their communications, was sufficiently interested in ending the siege by negotiation that they were willing to release prisoners and medical supplies as a gesture of good faith that suggested not a force at the peak of its operational confidence, but a force that had already begun to calculate costs. It did not mean the Germans were beaten. They were not. The fighting around Bastogne remained intense for weeks after the corridor opened, but it was a data point. And in the siege of Bastogne, where information was as scarce as morphine and artillery shells, data points were worth something. There are men whose names the history books learn easily, the generals, the commanders, the men who deliver famous one-word replies to German ultimatums. Their stories are accessible because they stand at the top of the organizational chart, because their decisions were documented in official communications, because the cameras found them afterward. Then there are the others, the men at the boundary wall, the men with the broomsticks and the pillowcases, the men who walked out across the frozen fields not knowing if the next sound they heard would be a rifle shot or a voice, and who found out only by walking forward. Sergeant Jackson was awarded the Bronze Star for his mission on December 22nd. The citation was brief, written in the standard military prose that manages simultaneously to describe extraordinary events and make them sound routine. He continued serving with the 502nd Parachute Infantry through the end of the European campaign. He was present at the liberation of several concentration camp subcamps in Bavaria in the spring of 1945. He returned to Pennsylvania in the autumn of that year, went back to the steel mill, married a woman named Catherine, and by most accounts rarely spoke about the war in any detail for the rest of his life. Dr. Werner Holtz, the German medical officer who returned the 3 American medics and a portion of the medical supplies, was captured by American forces in late January 1945 during the Allied counteroffensive that ultimately collapsed the Bulge. He spent several months as a prisoner of war before being repatriated to Germany. His subsequent fate is not documented in any source currently available in the public record. The Oberstleutnant who authorized the release of the prisoners and composed the informal surrender inquiry that traveled via Jackson and Davidson to McAuliffe's headquarters was killed during the fighting west of Bastogne on December 27th, the day after the corridor opened, when American armor and the reorganized 101st pressed outward to expand and secure the relief route. His name appears in the records of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division's war diary. He had commanded his battalion since the summer of 1943. The 3 medics Jackson brought home, Bergman, Torres, and Keene, all survived the war. Torres was wounded twice more before the German surrender. Keene served as a medic through the crossing of the Rhine. Bergman became a nurse after the war and spent 30 years in a hospital in Cleveland, treating civilian patients who would never know that the careful, methodical hands attending to them had once worked in a canvas tent behind a foxhole line in a Belgian winter, packing wounds with supplies that had been lost and found, and carried home across enemy ground by a sergeant with a white flag. The medical supplies Dr. Holtz returned, the sulfa powder, the morphine, the bandaging material, were used up within 48 hours of Jackson's return. There is no way to know precisely how many men they saved. That is the nature of medicine in war. The cost is visible and countable. The prevented deaths are not. You can count the bodies. You can't count the men who didn't become bodies. But Davidson's estimate of 36 hours of extended capacity is not nothing. 36 hours in Bastogne in December 1944 was the difference between a soldier who received treatment in time and a soldier who did not. Some of those soldiers went home. Some of their children are alive today. The arithmetic extends outward across generations in ways that are impossible to trace and impossible to dismiss. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945. The last German forces were pushed back across the German border by the end of the month. The bridge at Remagen was seized in March. The Rhine was crossed. Germany collapsed in stages through the spring, city by city, river by river, until on the 8th of May 1945, the formal instrument of unconditional surrender was signed at Reims, France, the same city from which the 101st Airborne had departed in darkness 5 months earlier, heading toward a crossroads town in Belgium that none of them had previously heard of. Bastogne became a symbol of American perseverance under siege. It became the name invoked when people wished to say that a position was held against impossible odds, that men refused to surrender when surrender would have been the easier and perhaps more rational choice. McAuliffe's nuts became famous precisely because it compressed the entire spirit of the garrison into a single word, defiant, almost casual in his contempt for the suggestion of defeat. But symbols simplify, and what is simplified, in the story of Bastogne, is the texture of how the garrison survived, not through a single grand gesture, but through hundreds of smaller ones, through the medics who kept working when the supplies ran out, through the artillery officers who rationed their shells to 10 per gun per day and still managed to break up the German attacks that came each night, through the engineers who fought as infantry, and the tankers whose vehicles had no fuel, but who found other ways to be useful, and the soldiers who wrapped themselves in burlap and hay and whatever else came to hand, and stayed in their foxholes through temperatures that should have killed them, and through a sergeant who walked out into the snow with a pillowcase on a broomstick, and came back with 3 men and a message and enough medical supplies to keep the surgeons working for another day and a half. History remembers Bastogne. It does not always remember the walk. But the walk happened. The men came back. The supplies kept the wounded alive. The intelligence helped the defenders hold the line for another 48 hours, until the clouds broke and the planes came and the corridor opened and the story resolved itself in a way that American mythology prefers, with relief arriving at the last possible moment, in a blaze of armor and air power across frozen ground, under a clear December sky. What the mythology leaves out is a sergeant standing at a stone boundary wall on a gray morning 5 days before any of that, raising a white pillowcase into the air and waiting to find out whether the next sound he heard would end him or answer him. It answered him. He came home. That is enough. That is, in the arithmetic of a war that consumed 50 million lives and lasted 6 years and remade the entire architecture of the world, sometimes all that can be said, that a man went out and came back, and the people he brought with him survived, and somewhere downstream of that survival, across decades and generations and the unremarkable passage of ordinary time, there are people living their lives who are alive because he walked into the cold with a pillowcase and did not flinch. The Ardennes are quiet now. The forests have reclaimed the foxholes. The stone boundary walls still stand in the fields west of Bastogne, the same walls that stood in December 1944, crusted with the same frost and the same winters, indifferent to the things that happened beside them and between them and across them. The farmhouse that served as a German battalion command post was rebuilt after the war. The rooms where the Oberstleutnant spread his maps and offered surrender terms and then, in a gesture that perhaps he himself did not fully understand, chose instead to send 3 prisoners home. Those rooms are ordinary rooms again. In the center of Bastogne stands a Martyrdom Memorial, a 5-pointed star of white stone set on a low hill above the town, with the names of the American states carved into its arms and the date December 1944 carved into its face. It is a large monument, visible from a great distance, as befits the scale of what happened there. Smaller things are harder to see. A 3-paragraph bronze star citation in a file box somewhere. A medical after-action report noting that partial supplies were returned by German medical personnel during a parley. 3 names on a list of recovered prisoners. The arithmetic of 36 hours. But they are there, in the record, if you know where to look. They are there. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.